In the last few decades, the world has heard countless voices raised against the violence of racism. But at the same time, there is a growing movement to dismiss anti-racism. Like in June 2021, when the Australian Senate voted to reject the inclusion of critical race theory in the national curriculum. This suggested revision of the curriculum aimed to educate students about the history and violence of colonialism, as well as the endurance of First Nations culture and people. This Senate vote amounted to more than just a rejection of critical race theory. It was a rejection of anti-racism itself. I'm Andrew Brooks, a researcher of media and culture at UNSW. My work shows that racism isn't just the problem of a few bad apples, but a systemic and fundamental component of our modern society. To understand this, we need to take a close look at what race and racism actually are. What, too, is anti-racism, and why does it matter? Most of us have an intuitive sense of what racism is. Or perhaps, like me, you've experienced its force bearing down on your body and spirit. Racism is often taken to mean prejudice against people who are different from us. But this definition advances the idea that there are inherent differences between groups of people. Arguments framed around us versus them imply that there are stable criteria at play. But history tells us this simply isn't the case. Ideas of race change and adapt, taking on different meanings at different points in time. Consider the changing set of policies that were implemented in Australia across the 20th century and that have come to be known as the White Australia policy. In 1901, one of the first pieces of legislation passed by the newly formed federal parliament was the Immigration Restriction Act, which encouraged British migration and prevented non-white people from arriving to Australia. The deportation of non-white foreigners took place alongside the forced assimilation of Indigenous people. During this period, Italian and Greek migrants were considered non-white and were subject to forms of racism that reproduced social, political, and economic hierarchies. But in the wake of World War II, driven by labour shortages and racist fears of Asian invasion, immigration policy changed to encourage the arrival of non-British Europeans displaced by the war. The goal was still the preservation of the white nation, but the terms of whiteness shifted through changes to laws and policies to include people who had previously been considered others. This history shows us that race is a tool of division and hierarchy that cannot be separated from power. When viewed in this way, we can see that race is not the cause of racism, but rather the result of it. Racism can better be defined as a regime of actions that attribute characteristics to groups of people in ways that create hierarchies of difference among those groups and provide a self-reinforcing rationale for racist aggression. Under this regime, it is the repeated acts of aggression that create the illusion that race is an objective reality, and those who call out racist behaviour still experience hostility. Champion AFL player Adam Goodes is an Adnyamathanha and Narungga man who, during a game between Sydney and Collingwood in 2013, was on the receiving end of a racial slur from the stands. He expressed his hurt but didn't blame the girl who called out to him, attributing it instead to the environment that she grew up in and that had shaped her behaviour. Nevertheless, after the incident, Goodes was repeatedly booed during games, ultimately forcing his early retirement in 2015. Racism is not an aberration, but rather is embedded in our modern society. Fans responded to Goodes' charge of racism by punishing him and excluding him from the game. It can help to think of race as a kind of technology, as the scholar Wendy Kyung-Chun does. Today we think of technology as the sleek gadgets that surround us, but in a broader sense it describes the application of knowledge in ways that let us interact with and organise the world. Technologies can be tools, customs, or narratives that help to structure society. Consider the successive technologies that have revolutionised written communication. We've moved from inscriptions in stone through papyrus and quills to the printing press, typewriter, and eventually the word processors and personal computers in our pockets today. Each change represents an evolution in the devices themselves, but also corresponds to major shifts in language, knowledge, representation, and political organisation. Technology and behaviour form a feedback loop, with each shaping the other. Within this framework, race can also be considered a technology, one that is primarily concerned with the organisation and management of human difference. It is a symbolic and political concept with tangible impacts. As with the evolution of written communication, over time the technology of race has taken many different and sometimes contradictory forms. You might not have heard of the concept of blood quantum, but this has been a central racial technology of the settler state. The idea that blood can be measured in mathematical fractions promotes a biological conception of race that has no scientific basis. Blood quantum has been used to both exclude First Nations people from the citizenry and as a justification for assimilation. In other words, the idea that blackness could be bred out. These supposedly biological metrics for race create social hierarchies, helped along by tabulation in the written record, which allows for repetition and persistence of certain ideas and serves to reinforce them. Record keeping enables the formation of official archives, which informs the production of laws, policies, education systems, and cultural representations. Technologies of race are both repeated and codified through institutions of power and shift over time as political conditions evolve. It isn't possible to talk about race as a technology without looking at the broader social systems that produce and reproduce it. And this is what is meant by structural or systemic racism. In Australia, those social systems are predominantly settler colonialism and capitalism. It's easy to see how colonialism is inherently racist. Settler colonialism is a form of domination in which one group of people occupies the territory of another with the intention of ultimately replacing the colonised group to make a new home and society. Establishing and maintaining a settler colony requires a shifting set of racial aggressions of varying brutality, including frontier massacres, the denial of Indigenous sovereignty, forced relocation from traditional lands, child abduction, resocialisation, religious conversion, and imprisonment. Eventually, colonial power settles down into secure and apparently reasonable social systems, which nevertheless uphold the dispossession of Indigenous people. Of course, this settling down of power does not displace the direct violence of the settler state, something that is clear when we look at the mass incarceration of First Nations people or ongoing deaths in custody. The role of capitalism in shaping race as a technology is less obvious. Capitalism is defined as a mode of commodity production that has the goal of accruing surplus value or profit. Ultimately, that profit comes from human labour, and one way of generating more of that value is to exploit differences among groups, such as gender and race. This can be most clearly seen when examining certain demographics of the labour pool. We've all heard of the gender pay gap, but racialised wage gaps can be seen in the case of migrant workers who are forced to take on poorly paid service sector jobs and gig work, or the racial breakdown of unemployment figures. In turn, the racialised poor are likely to find it harder to access the services and systems needed for housing, health, and education, and consequently are more likely to find themselves on the receiving end of attention from the police. Race is a foundation of colonialism and capitalism. It is a technology that is codified in law, written into policy, enacted through violence and reproduced in institutions, and expressed as discourse, often with deadly results. And when we see race as a technology that is designed to uphold colonialism and capitalism, we see why anti-racist stances are being attacked. Because anti-racism isn't just about dismantling individual racist attitudes, it's about transforming the entire foundation of our society. The murder of George Floyd sparked the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and beyond, while the continuing mistreatment of Aboriginal prisoners has inspired the Stop Deaths in Custody movement here in Australia. As part of these movements, millions of people have taken to the streets to challenge white supremacy, and young people everywhere are developing an anti-racist consciousness, realising that to live in a world without the violence of racism, everything must change. This poses a major threat to the institutions of capitalism and colonialism, as well as the people whose social and economic success relies on them. To live an anti-racist life means confronting the structural and systemic nature of racism, paying attention to how the technology of race shifts and adapts to serve our modern society. If we understand what race is and what it does, then we can join forces with others to fight to bring about a world where race no longer exists.